Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cartesian Theater. Okay, so about our event and our schedule today. So we have Dennett's Prize ceremony and Andy's lecture. And after, we will have like additional activity, a movie, Dulcinea Dialectic by Tao Ruspoli, but it's up to you if you have time, so please stay here and watch this film about relations and difference between human consciousness and artificial consciousness. And we have a great, today we have a great illusionist panel, and Nick as well. I'd like to invite Dmitry Volkov, co-founder of the International Center for Consciousness Studies, entrepreneur, founder of Social Discovery Group, and Eva AI philosopher. So, please.
Good morning, everyone. Dan was a very, very special person for me. So we were friends for something like 20 years, I think, and he was much older than me, I think, but every time, at least I thought of him as a grand figure, as maybe like a father or grandfather. So, but I never thought that there would be a day when Dan is not going to be there. I mean, it's an obvious thing, but I've actually never considered that he's going to be gone and we're going to have a meeting or a conference where he's not going to be presenting and not going to be giving us these wonderful thought experiments that he was pulling out of his, box, like a Pandora box. So I would like to, today I would like to read a post that I made a couple days after I've learned that he was gone. And this post is a kind of, is a pledge. It's something I commit to and I want to publicly commit to. On the 19th of April, Dan Dennett passed away. I saw him as a mentor and intellectual father. He was the smartest person I knew, graduated from Harvard and Oxford, best philosophy schools of that time. He was an autodidact in many other areas: biology, psychology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence. In his view, science and philosophy were continuous in their methods and commitment to clarity, objectivity, and truth. Being a distinguished professor, he kept his modesty. He would attend lectures of young scientists and cite in his books with admiration many of his students. He continued to educate himself through life, and I commit doing the same. Dan was a metaphysical minimalist. He was a devotee of Occam's razor. It's a virtue to rely only on what is necessary and not dwell in the luxury of unnecessary intellectual goods like unicorns, walking on water, or immaterial souls that are free from the laws of nature. I passionately subscribe to this view. Dan was certain that no miracles or religion or authority is required for humans to be ethical. He fought against dogmas that ground hatred toward other people. He was an exemplary ethical person himself. I think there's no excuse for not being ethical. Dan was bold in his philosophical work, never shy in dealing with hardest questions, never shy being in the minority, and I commit to this stance, his intentional stance. Dan loved music. When he was younger, he entertained the idea of becoming a jazz pianist. Some people say physicalists are dry people. They have no soul and believe in no miracles. He was never dry. He had a soul, a big soul made of billions of tiny robots. I saw him crying listening to Bach. He thought Bach was a miracle. He started a whole new era of analytical philosophy and by marrying brain research, philosophy of mind, and computer science. We are observing its results with the AI revolution now, and we will sooner or later see proof of his biggest hypothesis, the possibility of artificial minds. Dan is gone. I feel very, very, very sad. Every year he was sending his family members and very close friends a letter describing how everyone in his family was doing and what they have achieved this year. I was lucky to be a recipient of these letters since we've met in 2007. So the letter from 2024 was the last. Dan wrote more than a dozen philosophical books that became bestsellers with wit, humor, plenty of science, and crystal clear arguments. Something that his time is running out of, he wrote in his autobiography, like one of his teachers did, Quine. It is a fascinating reading. Dan was committed to the view that the person is a center of narrative gravity. His biography is where Dan will continue to exist as much as in the hearts and minds of these people who valued him, learned from him, and loved him. My condolences to all these people and to Susan more than others. So, I don't want to stop on a sad note, so I want to tell you a story. Some of you may have heard this story, but I think it's a funny story. It's a story about Dan and Ned Block. I'm originally from Moscow, and I was associated with Moscow State University. So I lived in Moscow, but we really, a lot of our friends and colleagues were in the U.S., and I was visiting U.S. very often. So one of my trips, I asked my professor, my advisor in Moscow State University, Vadim Vasilyev, who some of you met, to join me for the trip to Boston. So we arranged for two very important meetings for us, one with Ned Block and one with Dan Dennett. So we arrived to New York and then decided to take a car. We rented a car, decided to drive all the way to Boston for these meetings. So we get on the car, we get to drive to Boston. We had a wonderful conversation on the road there, talking about all these wonderful theories of mind. And we arrive like an hour earlier to the restaurant where we were supposed to meet Ned. I think the meeting was at 9 or something like that. So we arrived, and we're really, really hungry. And so I'm a relatively small person. My advisor is a very big person. So we arrive, we order full breakfast, and then we started ordering additional stuff, and we have the whole table covered with all kind of food. Very happy. It's like a feast. And then we look at the clock, and wow, Ned Block must be coming in 2 minutes. So we ask the waiter, clean this out. We didn't come for food. We came for intellectual food. So we come there. Here, we sit there. The table is clean, and Ned Block is arriving. Of course, we had a great conversation with him. I'm not going to talk about philosophy. So we talked about things, and then Ned says, you guys want to have something, and something to eat? We're like, oh, no. He's like, oh, come on, you're my guests. So we order little salads, and Ned is ordering some breakfast. And I have to say, it was a pretty expensive restaurant. So when the meal is over, it was like, okay, we have another meeting, and, So Ned is like, okay, well, I'll cover the bill. So no. And he's like, oh, don't worry, you haven't eaten anything. And we're like, and he's like, come on, you're my guests. And he's like, oh, no problem. He starts opening his wallet. The waiter comes with a bill. And I can see how Ned is being really surprised. He's reading through all the stuff that it's like a whole menu. I have to say, Ned is a very courageous person. He took a bold decision to cover the bill anyway. We felt really bad. So that's how we met Ned, and that's why he's not on this conference. But next meeting was with Dan, but we also had some time. We put some lag between the meetings, so we were like, what are we going to do? So I think that was it in Taft? I think it was in Taft. So Taft is close to Boston, right? So it was in Taft. So we looked at the schedule in the university, and we suddenly see that there's a lecture of Stan Dien that's happening right now. So we're like, oh, so we can save some time, we can listen to the lecture. So we go to the lecture, and Stan starts presenting, and then I see Daniel Dennett there. And I don't know why, but I'm like, Vadim, I'm talking to my mentor, to my advisor, I was like, well, Dan is there. I don't think we want to see, if he sees us there, he's like, he would think we're stalking him or something. It's like we're watching after him. This is not a really good way to approach a philosopher. So we were like sitting there, and every time Dan is like looking around, I'm like hiding behind Vadim, and Vadim he's a very big person. He's like trying to hide. So we were like in this lecture watching that Dan doesn't notice us. And then another thought is coming. There's time for our meeting, and Dan is still sitting there, and it's like, oh, he's probably going to miss the meeting. We're like, whoa, this is a very difficult situation. He's sitting, maybe he thinks this is more important. Of course it was more important than our meeting, but it's... And then Dan stands up, takes his pole and starts walking slowly out of the auditorium. And we're like, okay, so he's probably attending our meeting. So we stand up and quietly start walking. And so we walk, it was like a 15-minute walk to the restaurant. We were following Dan, and every time he would like duck. So when he arrived to the restaurant, we arrived in the minute, and he's like, oh. He says like, did you guys just arrive here? I was like, yeah. And did you just like follow me? So, no. So anyways, so I have to say that we lied to Dan Dennett. We didn't tell him that we were following him all the way from the lecture. I don't know, it sounded very embarrassing to us at this time. Well, that's why commitment to truth means I will open it. I'm confessing now in front of everybody publicly saying, I'm sorry, I lied to Dan Dennett, but maybe he would excuse me. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll pass the word to the next speaker. All right.
Dmitry, thank you. It was a very warm, heartfelt tribute to Dan. You would have loved it. This is the first time I've ever been inside a Cartesian theatre, and it makes me think, here I am in a place which doesn't exist. So what's going to happen at the end of that? It reminds me of an anecdote, or there's a recording by, again, poet Coleridge, who said, I had a dream, and in my dream I went to heaven, and in heaven I plucked a blue flower. And and then next morning when I awoke, I found the blue flower in my hand. So perhaps we'll, having been in a Cartesian theatre, when we awake, we'll find that actually the Cartesian theatre isn't such an illusion as we might have thought it was. But I'll leave that for another time. Okay, so it's very hard to believe that just a year ago, we were all mourning Dan, who had died a month or so earlier, and at a meeting, again organized by Pietro and Dmitry, we were wondering what we could do to celebrate Dan, and Dmitry had the idea, well, why don't we have an annual prize? Well, initially a prize, but then it became an annual prize. We'd call it the Dennett Prize, and it would go to somebody who continued Dan's tradition insofar as that was possible, and whom he himself would have been proud to have adopted, as Dmitry says, as one of his children. We hadn't a lot of time to organize it. Andrew Mitzalov took charge. within a month or so, at least by the time we had advertised it, all the top philosophers of mind and neuroscientists in the area had applied or had been nominated for this prize, which gave us a bit of a problem. We had a committee. It consisted of Dimitri and me and Giorgio Valitagara and Keith Frankish, and we thought, well, how do we decide between all these top people, all of whom could in principle deserve this prize? Well, there was one criterion which we had, thank goodness, to work on, which is who would Dan himself have liked to have had this prize if it had been entirely in his choice, and he often hoped things would end up entirely in his doing or in his choice. And so we had our own ideas about that, but we consulted Susan, and Susan Dennett, and she'd been rather shy of taking part in this, but now she didn't have any compunction in saying, she said, if you choose Andy Clark, Dan would have been so pleased. Or I should have said, she said, Dan will be so pleased, because she was still speaking in the present tense, as people do about people who are deceased. I of course, and I was very happy that choice was supported, and unanimously we voted for Andy to get the prize in this first year. I've known of Andy for a long time before I knew him personally. I reviewed his first book, Being There, back in 1997, 98, and I was bowled over by it, I have to say. I'll just quote what I wrote in my review of his book. I wrote, "Psychology has seen several revolutions in its short lifetime: behaviorism, Gestalt psychology, information theory, cognitive science, now neuroscience, but no theoretical insight has ever seemed so likely to change the landscape permanently as the one in this brilliant book. Although Clark is a professional philosopher, Being There is the most unlikely philosophical text you can imagine. Rather than relying on fanciful examples, Clark's argument is almost disconcertingly practical and down to earth. His conclusion is, humans are good at frisbee and bad at logic." Well, Dan himself, of course, was good at both frisbee and logic, as I should say Andy himself turned out to be. When we thought about how to represent Dan and what kind of actual trophy we might attach to this monetary prize, which Dimitri had generously funded, we'd asked Susan whether there was anything of Dan's which she thought would represent the complete Dan, and she extraordinarily came up with this, well, it's up the Crusader statue, which I'd never seen, but which Susan said was, to her, it symbolized Dan's dedication to his ideas and his wish to spread the concepts worldwide. Well, so Dan was a practical man as well as a theorist, and it was central to his whole way of thinking about the world and about what mattered in it, and of course to his theoretical position. But Occam's razor is not exactly the term I would have used. Sorry, let's go back. So I need to go back one from that. Does that remind you of anything? This was the kind of Occam's razor which Dan Dennett wielded, and his strategy was, to some extent, was to slash and burn. And this was true in his life as well. I was reminded of a quotation about Ernest Rutherford, that his mind was like the brow of a battleship. Brushing aside all irrelevancy, he went straight for his goal. And I just thought I'd share with you, just for old time's sake, a piece of film which shows Dan wielding a chainsaw 30, 40 years ago, when he came to help my wife and I out with settling into our new house in New York. Some of you have seen, I've showed it last year when I talked about Dan, but I want to show it again. And we need Andrew to turn the sound on now for this. Okay. This is Dan in 1994, I think. No sound. We need sound on this. Dan is fitting.
Out of the way. It's going to be noisy and...
Put your earphones on.
See what we've done? Well, we cut this huge piece out with a chainsaw, which is the only way we could get in close enough to the edges. No other power saw could get that. And Nick was going to do it all with this little saw. But we thought that probably we should do it now with this chain.
Sorry?
And, 9, 18, 95.
That's great. Do you have assistance?
So there's, you switch me back on again. Dan signing off on his handiwork there. I like to think this is in the kitchen of this house in Bedford. One day people will do some archaeology and discover this inscription and wonder whatever it meant. Dan Dennett done it. But we philosophers, psychologists in consciousness studies, we know what Dan Dennett done. Anyone does the archaeology of the story of consciousness studies, they're going to find Dan's signature at the base of a lot of the major achievements in our science. And next to them, I think we'll find in the next door tomb, perhaps that's the wrong way to put it, we'll find Andy Clark's signature, because Andy too has done it in ways which are going to be lasting far beyond the immediate effects on which we all know about. So I'm going to hand over now to Susan Blackmore to introduce, well not introduce, but to bring Andy on stage and to give him this trophy which has been based on Dan's own soapstone sculpture. So, Susan, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Right, I've got to come down and pick you up, have I, and bring you up onto the stage? Well, Nick said. We
swap places, Susan.
Yeah. Right, here he comes. I'm sure you all know him by now, but it's a delight for me to be asked to introduce Andy Clark. And as Nick has said, what better choice could there be? Andy and Dan's work have reflected each other all the time they've known each other. I read somewhere that Andy said that he was bowled over when he first came across Dan's work as a student, as was I. And was I when I read Being There, putting brain, body, and world back together again. And that is what Andy, above all, has done for me and for the world. It's so obvious when I read that book. Well, of course, but why didn't I think of it before? And I think that's often the best. I'm not a philosopher, but the best philosophy for me is when it makes sense and you go, of course, that's right. Thrust away a lot of the rubbish as Dan would do. So from that book, Andy has written lots more books, Supersizing the Mind, Surfing Uncertainty, the latest one, which I read with great pleasure when it came out a few years ago, The Experience Machine. Wonderful books, and I would recommend them all. Andy has worked in Bloomington, University of Indiana, in Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. Spent a long time in Edinburgh, which is when I think we first met with his partner, Alexa, whom I already knew before you did, where he was the professor of logic and metaphysics. And he is now professor of cognitive philosophy. What a wonderful thing. I mean, cognitive philosophy didn't exist so long ago, did it? They're a wonderful bringing together, as Dan did, which is again why it's such a good choice. Taking the findings of neuroscience, the kind of things that a lot of us do and you do, and the philosophy, and bring them together when they were far apart. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Andy before he gives his lecture, and even more so to present you with this wonderful thing. Very much deserved, Andy. I'm delighted to give you something of Dan.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate all the lovely comments, but really, I'm just so delighted and honored to receive the Daniel Dennett Prize. I'm going to keep this brief because a lot of stuff has been said and said so well already. But in a long and productive life, Dan Dennett made huge contributions, as we know, to philosophy, to cognitive science, maybe more importantly, I think, to humanity, to our self-understanding as a human species. He showed us new ways to think about mind, free will, and consciousness. But again, I think maybe more importantly, he demonstrated in his own life how you can be both a staunch and vocal atheist and a firm believer in human community and the power of goodwill to transform society. And in fact, what I'm going to do with a little bit of the monetary bit of this award is make a contribution to the UK humanists, which I think is a cause that Dan was very supportive of. Okay. Well, but what about me? What he showed to me as an undergraduate in the late 1970s, studying philosophy just as a minor, because I was really doing French literature, what Dan showed to me was how to have fun doing philosophy of mind. When I first encountered Dan's writings, I was blown away by the style and also the content. Dan's writing was rich and colourful, deeply connected to the best science of the day, full of powerful examples and thought experiments. The style was open, engaging, playful. It was a way of writing that said to me, at least, that you didn't have to already be a member of the proper philosophers club or know all the Greek letters or any of the Masonic handshakes for your thoughts and ideas to matter and be taken seriously. So as a kind of first-generation academic going through the UK state school system, this was really encouraging to me, and I very soon switched my major from French literature into philosophy. Just from reading Dan's stuff, he obviously, he wasn't around at the University of Stirling back in the 70s, but the stuff was there. Okay, so I knew immediately that this way of doing philosophy would work for me. I think what Dan was doing was basically dipping into everything that philosophy and science had to offer and trying to see if you could sort of jiggle it all around and make something new and interesting emerge. He was, in a way, I think, maybe taking a bit of a chainsaw to a lot of the traditional ways of thinking about these subjects. Dan's goal was to see if these old puzzles looked different once we tackled them in ways that were a bit more like engineers and designers. So, think about what tools you need, get the chainsaw out. And I think that was the core Dennett move. Take a topic like free will or consciousness and ask again and again how you might build or design something to behave in the way that creatures like that behave. That meant taking biology, AI, and neuroscience seriously, and that's the recipe that I've been trying to live up to in my own work. Dan's influence on me took other forms too. Although at the time I'd never met Dan in person, he was somehow persuaded by Harry and Betty Stanton, who were spearheading cognitive science at MIT Press at the time, to be a reviewer for my first book, which is actually Microcognition, back in 1989, back in the days of parallel distributed processing. So Dan reviewed that very wonderfully for MIT Press, and he said, I remember this, in the review there, he said, "This book could have been expressly written to gain my approval," which really stuck with me, I think Dan's ways of thinking had even then sort of beneficially parasitized my own brain, my own ways of thinking. And I think I can honestly say that I've got a kind of internal Dan now that is a sort of critic such that stuff doesn't get out unless it's been passed by the internal Dan. And I think that Dan would have appreciated that. You know, there's a sort of way of living on in ways of doing philosophy and ways of thinking about things. So I think that that's somehow that sort of speaks to Dan's core commandments. Okay, Dan the person, one of the most intellectually generous people I've ever met. He was always trying to see the germ of a good idea, even in the wildest of conjectures. And along with the amazing Susan Dennett, he extended a lot of personal hospitality to myself and to many other researchers, and especially perhaps to his own students, who I think Dan had especially close relationships with, which were really important. So thanks to Dan and Susan, Blue Hill Farm, not to mention the cognitive cruises and all his other nautical adventures, became kind of prime thinking salons for the 21st century. Those of us that were lucky enough to be in any of those will recall Dan and Susan as the perfect hosts, organising discussions, games, events, food and outings. And that in the end I think is how I remember Dan best, as a kind of intellectual singularity, buzzing with energy and ideas, open to every idea and experience, and somehow almost uniquely able to get the best out of everyone that he came into contact with. So thanks Dan, thanks Susan, thank you Keith Frankish, Nick Humphrey, Andrew Mertzaloff, Artem Besedin, and all the organisers and enablers of this wonderful event. I couldn't be more thrilled or pleased than to be receiving the Dan Dennett Award, and I hope that Dan, as the internal sort of meme inside me, is pleased as well. Thank you. So what happens next is, after a brief fight with the microphone, I'm going to plonk myself exactly here and see, my clicker is now a bit far away from its recipient, so some clicks may take longer than they ought to take. Okay. There's also another small technical hitch, which, well, it's not really a hitch, but I don't have a screen to view my own stuff on, so there is no inner view in here. We're going kind of straight from the outside to the responses. No inner viewings, we've cut the middle toad right out. Okay, so what we have here is one of the sort of Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome designs. So I was at the Pompidou Centre some years ago, a couple of years back, and I encountered the Buckminster Fuller exhibition. I was in touch with Dan after that, and I just happened to mention it. So Dan responded, I thought he would just say, oh yeah, nice exhibition, but no, Dan sort of knows everyone and has thoughts about everything. So Dan's reply then was, Fuller once stayed in a cousin's house in Andover, just a couple of houses down the street from ours. The occupants had showed me model geodesic domes that they had in their carriage house. Dan then said, I wonder what became of them. I became fascinated, almost obsessed with geodesic domes when I was in Oxford doing my DPhil. I realized that since hexagons tile a plane, think bathroom floor tiles, there must be interesting geometric fudges involved in getting, as I think Fuller claimed, arbitrarily multi-tile domes approximating to spheres very closely. So Dan's already kind of asking sort of engineering and design questions about these things. And then he says, but you know, I never figured it out, in spite of making a number of models with drinking straws and thread in our flat. Whoops, yay, he told you so yet. He says the wooden one in the foreground appears to be an ordinary dodecahedron with hexagons and pentagons, a lovely object. It's a bit the way soccer balls are made. But how do you start with one of those and turn every face into a curved surface composed of more? So Dan's unearthed a puzzle within what appear to be just kind of cool demonstrations. He says, look, the pressure and the leather take care of it for the soccer ball, but when I look at photographs of the large-scale domes, it seems to me they've always got some bits hidden from view. Am I just stupid? Dan was always humble about this stuff. You know, he thought there might be an easy answer. He even thought, strangely, that maybe I would have it, which is a very unlikely thing. He said, do you know how to make a regular geodesic dome with indefinitely many faces? I said, no, not really. He said, one of my haptic whittles is a soccer ball inside a soccer ball, whittled when I was on the sidelines of one of my son Peter's high school games. So I just kind of feel like this encompasses such a lot of stuff about Dan. Dan found many, many things intriguing. There's another one of them. This is Tati, the robot dog, that Dan picked up in an antique store in Paris, I think. He was always puzzled, never found out where it came from, who made it, kept trying, stuck it on the cover of one of his books. Still, you know, it's an unsolved mystery as far as I know to this day. So if anyone here can solve it, that too would please Susan anyway. So once Dan was intrigued, as I say, he never, ever, ever let go. And in order to understand stuff, what Dan always wanted to do, as you see in the geodesic dome case, was make a model. You know, if you see geodesic domes and you wonder about it, let's get some straws out and try and make a model. Let's also try to spot the subtle tricks that make it seem harder or more magical than it is. You know, what's hidden in those surfaces that you don't see in the geodesic domes that are actually making the thing possible when, in a certain way, it looks like it shouldn't be possible when Dan was thinking about it from first principles. So I think this is really a kind of microcosm of Dan's approach in general. You know, so we're all here thinking a bit about consciousness, a bit about illusionism, and I think that the question that Dan was always asking is, how do you build something that behaves in the ways that these things behave? How can ordinary material stuff be organized so as to do these weird things that conscious beings do? Have conferences, for example, think about consciousness, think that they have consciousness, think it's puzzling. What's going on that's crucial but somehow we're not quite spotting it? What are the tricks? I actually think that this sort of means that, in a way, Dan's interest from the outset was closer to what Dave Chalmers has lately been calling the meta problem. I think Dan was always interested in what is it about consciousness that makes it seem more puzzling than perhaps it really is or really ought to be. There we go. So I think for Dan, maybe that was the main puzzle in the vicinity, and that's a puzzle that I want to look at today. So I'm going to continue the illusionist trend of this meeting, of the illusionist CCS. Right. Come on. Okay, Cartesian Gravity is in the title of this talk. The talk is called Escaping Cartesian Gravity. Cartesian gravity was mentioned, I think, by Katerina. Someone mentioned Cartesian gravity along the way. It's a central sort of organizing meme in From Bacteria to Bach and Back, which is an excellent sort of pulling a lot of stuff together book that I would highly recommend. So what is it? Cartesian gravity is, roughly speaking, the pull of the self-image that says that we are home to this kind of weird stuff, you know? The inner viewings, the qualia, the ineffable stuff, maybe. So what are qualia? I'm not going to spend long on this. I think, you know, we all know what they're supposed to be. Maybe there's some of them sort of moving around up there. They're sort of, you know, they might change if you have one too many glasses of raki. Qualia is, in some sense, a what it's likeness of these encounters. What's it like to have a hangover? What's it like to see those colours swirling around? And the mistake, as Dan saw it, was to think of qualia as involving the presence of intrinsic properties. I think it's kind of really important to see that that's the thing that Dan is arguing against. You know, he's not arguing against there being something worth calling consciousness. He's not arguing against there being something worth calling human experience. He's not arguing against the idea that I have experiences and the statue doesn't. But he is saying that there are no features of those experiences that outrun or that could outrun the stuff that Dan thought you could get your hands on. That's to say, our own discriminative capacities and our tendencies to react, judge, and respond. Go on. So just, you know, to make sure that we don't lose sight of that, I think for Dan that was the only stuff that we needed to get rid of. If you were skeptic about anything, it was that stuff, these intrinsic features that are not cacheable out in terms of functions and responses and reactions and discriminations. Okay. So Dan wants to get rid of those, and I think that Dan clearly thought that this was how to do the science of consciousness, that you couldn't even do the science until you basically got rid of those kinds of false targets. So if you managed to do that, then you would have finally escaped the pull of Cartesian gravity. And that's a project that I'm going to try and pursue a little bit further. As I say, there's a quick quote from Dan. He says, "I'm not denying the reality of consciousness at all. I'm just denying that consciousness, real consciousness, is like what they think it's like." So let's get rid of the monsters, but not experience, not consciousness, just the monsters. Yes. Art by Sora, Dan escaping Cartesian gravity. It took me a long time to get Sora to produce this, because for ages and ages it kept saying, I can't do a real person. So in this doesn't look much like Dan. Then in the end it was because it just had to be a philosopher, a famous philosopher of mind. And that's where we got to. So I think I'm going to start with a quick tour of how Dan was doing this. Oops, a daisy. And then I'm going to fire Dan's way of doing it up with a new example that I think might be handy. And then I'm going to revisit some classic worries, and that will be it. Yes. Okay, lots of you will have seen these pictures before. The next few slides go back to a talk that I gave on the cruise around Greenland that Dan organized with Moscow State University students, with Dmitry, and a bunch of people, including Dave Chalmers and Nick Humphrey. You can also see Jesse Prince there, Alexa made it there, and of course Dan. Anyway, the thing at the top is who introduces who. So this was used in a kind of format that Dan really liked, which is get someone else to introduce your views and do it succinctly. And somehow along the way there, I had the job of introducing Dan's views, which of course made me extremely nervous. Okay. Clicker doesn't want to click. Click. There we go. This is another earlier example of the same format. This was a mental representations workshop at Blue Hill Farm in 1999. And you can see John Haugland, the late John Haugland, and Rob Cummins in there. And it was the same format, and it works really well with food and all the hospitality and games and everything that Dan and Susan made emerge so naturally from their wonderful farmhouse gatherings. So what's the core argument in Dan Dennett? Remember, I'm presenting this in front of Dan, so say this is your core argument. You want to. You're going to be a bit nervous. Okay, this is the core of Dan's argument, is there's no double transduction in the brain, and that's it. That's really the core. Everything else that Dan's ever written or said is just cleanup around that core point. I got away with that. Dan agreed with that, so good. So what is that core argument? The idea is that we're sort of hit, the brain is hit, the person, the embodied organism is hit by a barrage of energies coming from the outside world, and the brain's job is to turn those into responses, apt responses. And that's all that you need to explain. You need to explain how that happens. There's no room if you like, in that explanatory schema for translation first into something else that then mediates between the sort of input and the output in the way that classic qualia are sometimes thought to do. So, of course, there's a lot of mediating stuff. A whole lot goes on in my head and in my body as these transductions happen. But one transduction that would be utterly useless, Dan thought, was transduction into an inner viewing, because then you've got to take the inner viewing and do something with it. And I think Dan's view was, let's just cut that out. That is what that is the idea of cutting out the Cartesian theatre. No need for the inner viewing, and even worse, suppose that the inner viewing was to occur, you would still need to, as it were, use the inner viewing to generate the spike train. So Dan thinks that you would then be asking for a third, and in this case, utterly redundant transduction. So as I say, I do feel a bit like this, not having my own screen in front of me and having to turn around all the time. It's like, yeah, I'm missing my inner viewings here. There we go. Okay, so that, I think, is cutting out the middle toad. Just take the energies, turn them into spike trains or whatever happens to be the right description of the biological goings-on. Use them, suitably elaborated, processed, reverberated, re-entered, combined, compared, and contrasted, so as to drive action, including, but not exclusively, verbal report, which we'll come back to later. cut out the middle toad. Right. So, you know, stamping out the threat of double transduction is a good start, but Dan saw that that's not the place that you really want to finish. Because even if you cut out the middle toad, it often seems to us as if we have a middle toad. It seems to us as if we're experiencing rich, qualitative experiences along the road to response. So why is that the case? We are owed an account of that. Woohoo. So, yeah, we're owed an account of that, and I think if we could give an account of that, which is pretty well resolved in the meta problem as Dave has it, I think if we could do that to everyone's satisfaction, including Dave's, that would surely spell the end of the qualia wars. That would just be it. Job done. That is a goose upside down. There's a thing that birds do, apparently, geese in particular, which is fly upside down to confuse people. It's called whiffling. So if you see something apparently upside down, it really is upside down, actually. So Dan brings on stage an idea here, the idea of the strange inversion. The idea of a strange inversion is that you take some received wisdom and you turn it upside down. The one that I like to use as an example is the lovely taste of the Guinness in certain bars. Some bars, particularly in Dublin, are famous for the goodness of their Guinness. You might think that this is because their Guinness is special, and in a way it is. But it's the bar's reputation for serving good Guinness that makes the Guinness there so good. So more and more people order, there's a good throughput of Guinness, they go to the bar because it's got that reputation perhaps, and it all carries on as a result. It's the bar's reputation for serving good Guinness that makes the Guinness taste so good. And that, I think, is a kind of strange inversion. You thought that the reputation was due to the special nature of the Guinness in that bar, but in fact the special nature is due to the reputation. We've kind of got the cart before the horse, as it were. And of course that reputation is further cemented every time someone goes there and orders Guinness. So it's like, yeah, this really works. You know, that model that says the Guinness in this bar is especially good is a good model of the world because it's getting me good Guinness. So it's passing quite a lot of tests. So Dan says things like this about honey, for example. He says, consider the sweet taste of honey. The standard story is that we like the honey because it tastes so sweet, or some of us do. There's stuff to say about honey haters like me, but we'll put that aside for now. We think we like the honey because it tastes so sweet. But in fact, maybe my liking of the honey is nothing other than that pattern of dispositions that I may have, if I'm a honey lover, to respond and react in certain ways, to seek it out, to lick it, to refuse to share it with other honey lovers, to gift it to other honey lovers, etc., etc. So it's not the sweetness that explains our response, if Dan's right. It's our whole response profile that constitutes the sweetness. So sweetness is not really playing the role that you might have thought it's playing. It's not really driving your responses. It kind of is your responses, might be a way of thinking about that. So, but not knowing that, we project the sweetness onto the Cartesian theatre, the inner realm, a realm populated by loads of these things, the sweetness of the honey, the cuteness of the baby, the redness of the chair, the painfulness of the toe. So you're going to have to somehow deal with all of these things using roughly the same kind of schema. I think Nick thinks you can't deal with all these things using the same kind of schema. You're going to need radically different schemas for some of them, but we can come to that. Okay, so the pattern of abilities probably stems in part from hidden facts about our own evolutionary history. The history has clearly set us up to like some kinds of things, energy-rich foodstuffs, for example. And if you're a honey hater like me, then you probably had some, either you started in a strange place or you had early experiences that installed a model that was a bit anti-honey. So, you know, you can tell a story about the honey haters. But there's sort of an underlying evolutionary justification for patterns of discriminative response that turn out to be good for creatures like us. So, yeah, I'm not going to pause on individual variation. I think we can imagine how that goes. So I think it's a good move. Dan thought it was a good move. I agree. It aims to show why we think that the world is populated with these things with their own special causal powers, sweet taste, the cuteness of babies, etc. But then the question arises, so how does that work? How does the seeming projection trick work? And why does it yield seeming qualia? I've not really said anything about that yet. And this is where Dan, on the boat and in a bunch of papers, presents a further argument, one that I think of as sort of something like Dan's Bayesian twist. So let's have a look at that. So this stuff, these ideas, I first came across them around August 2011 when I was stranded at Blue Hill with Dan and a bunch of his students who we were supposed to be going on a cognitive cruise exhibition, but Hurricane Irene struck. The upshot was I had no luggage because all the airports had kind of messed all that up. There was no real power, but Dan had a generator, which was quite handy, being Jan. And we were just stuck there for about 4 days. So what we did, what we were going to do on the boat, and we did in the farmhouse instead, was think about lots of target papers from Dan's group, from me, from other people. The one that I had at the time was the one that became eventually whatever next, the sort of early foray into predictive processing and active inference models. So what that paper, I'm not going to spend too long on the next couple of slides because nobody really wants to hear another introduction to predictive processing, but the kind of core idea is that intelligent agents are constantly trying to predict their own sensory flows. Trying to predict them drives the formation of a generative model, which is actually the same kind of generative model, broadly speaking, as those you're familiar with from contemporary foundation models, etc. So in order to do good prediction, models like that learn a set of ways of sort of categorizing and responding and sort of picking out patterns in huge corpuses of input data. So basically they can unearth deep latent variables that are structuring the space of the input data. And it turns out that if you unearth deep latent variables structuring the space of the input data for example, multimodal encounters with the world, you actually end up getting a good grip on the kinds of objects that populate that world, assuming you've got action routines that you're trying to cache out. So we're going to say more about action later. But the idea is, this is how you can get inferred distal causes to help in the prediction task. And you can probably see where this is going to go. So anyway, applied on a very grand scale, these sorts of pictures, I think, give us a practical sense of how a structured external world becomes known and becomes actionable. You spot the things that matter for a being like you. You drive action routines that will enable you to cache out the things that matter for a being like you. You resist dissipation over periods of time. And you do this basically because your core job, your core utility function, if you like, is to successfully predict the sensory flux, to do it in ways that are apt for the kind of embodied organism that you happen to be. So the idea is then you get the idea of, if you like, schooners, icebergs, philosophers, workshops, dinghies, waves, mines, excursions, and motor actions to get you on and off the dinghies. This all interestingly falls within the realm of easy problems, I would say, as far as the science, the kind of consciousness discussions are thinking about these things. Come on back. So basically, these are all content items. And I think that one way to think about the illusionist approach and Dan's approach to qualia is that they're disguised content items. In a way, they're just content items in our best model of ourselves and the world. So what we need to do is explain why content items like that arise. Which way am I going? That way? No, wrong way. There we go. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that some story like that works. It doesn't have to be predictive processing, but it's some story that highlights prediction and control in the service of embodied action. I have some other reasons for thinking that predictive processing is the best of the options in that ballpark, but that would do for these purposes. So at that point, you kind of accounted for the fact that some agents might judge in some qualia-neutral way that there's a structured world out there. you've accounted for the fact that they might know how to act in that structured world. And it's all done, I think, without any hint of double transduction. There's nothing kind of puzzling going on. So that's a lot, but we still need to explain, at the very least, why there seem to be qualia. So here's the remaining question. Why don't we encounter this structured and actionable world in the dark, as Dave has, I think, at some point put it? Yeah, he does, at the start of consciousness and its place in nature. In the dark meaning without any accompanying experiences or even seeming experiences. Can we close that gap? So this is where Dan tries out his Bayesian twist. This is Dan standing up on that particular Greenland thing that was very well timed to act as kind of me and Alexa's honeymoon. It was right after we got married, so that was very handy. And Dan is holding up there a Boston Zombie poster. Many of you will know that the Boston Zombie is the title of Dimitri's book about this stuff. So, what do we do? What does a Boston Zombie do in these circumstances? So Dan thought that we should think about what he called expecting ourselves to expect. The idea here, I'm going to run it briefly, is that we are prime objects for our own prediction machinery. To grapple with our own futures, we need to predict what we and others will do next. We need to predict what kinds of things we're each going to approach and what we're going to do about them, for example. Yay, come on back. So among the things that we predict, we're going to find a special subclass, predictions about our own reactive dispositions, and I think that Dan thought that that's where we finally get to grips with the question about why there really seem to be qualia. Right, come along. So the key idea is that seeming qualia are constructs that aim to predict our own and others' behaviors, including the behaviors in which we predict ourselves and others using those very constructs. So there's this kind of sort of layering of predictions upon predictions here. I actually like Dan's twist here so much that with his permission, I stole the title and used it for an ERC advanced grant to look at predictive processing and consciousness, which we were lucky enough to get. So thank you, Dan, for that as well. So, take the case of the honey. Suppose that among my many discriminative and reactive dispositions, I am a honey seeker. I tend to prefer it, to lick it, to sometimes hide it from other honey-seeking agents. And suppose I'm part of a community in which I speak and exchange ideas and plans with other agents. Within that community, you might want quick and easy ways of gesturing at my peculiar honey relative profile. To compress patterns like that, maybe the communicative Bayesian brain infers a simple hidden cause. We as a community slowly come to speak of folk liking. Excuse me. Okay. There's a change. I can hold that mic. Maybe this will be better. Yeah, okay, I'm just going to hold it. And try not to fall off the stage. There we go. Okay, so we as a community slowly come to speak of some folk liking the lovely taste of the honey. Over time, we generate what Dan on that expedition described as a maximally portable user illusion, a communal construct that then helps us predict, share, compare, and coordinate our behaviors with other agents in that same community. So the simplified self model is clearly useful. If I know that you like sweet things, I might know what to buy you for Christmas. If you know that I love salty things, or rather I know that I love salty things, that helps me keep an eye on my otherwise rather too strong disposition to consume cheese. And the talk itself isn't misguided, so we're going to come back to this towards the end. The talk isn't misguided. There are real patterns here in behavioral space that talk like that neatly compresses. But I've somehow fooled myself into thinking that these inferred qualia exist as something over and above the patterns that they so neatly capture. Qualia then appear, Dan says, to pass the Bayesian test for being an objective structural part of the world we live in. They appear to us as real independent causes, just like the stuff that is more distally out there, like stages and wood and Dan's sculpture, etc. So all this stuff is inferred in order to be the best, the most useful picture to you, the agent within a community of such agents, of how the world is. So armed with this qualia-laden self-image, we can start to pose exotic questions. Ones like, because we're also language users, and we'll come back to that later too. So we can ask ourselves questions like, even if all your discriminative capacities and reactive dispositions were identical to mine, couldn't your experience still be very different? At that point, we are sort of in zombie world. We've kind of opened the gates of qualia hell, I think. Okay, that's what qualia hell looks like. Okay, so I'm going to summarize so far, and then switch gear a bit into a new example, then revisit the old questions, then stop. Okay. So summary so far is that sweet tastes, cats, dogs, and icebergs are all just inferred content items. Items like latent variables, if you like, posited by the brain to minimize the complexity of a predictive model of self, other, and world. But if Dan's right, if Keith is right, if the illusionists are right, there's been a kind of metaphysical inflation whereby we now mistake some of them for intrinsic features of a mysterious inner realm. So that's my best shot at a rapid reconstruction. There are some hiccups in sort of the expecting ourselves to expect thing. I go through them in my reply to Dan in BBS because I felt like Dan might have too many layers of expectation in there, and that maybe you didn't need one of the extra layers, but it's just a mild quibble. What I want to do now to defend and expand upon Dan's picture is introduce something that Dan fully recognized but didn't think very much about, I think, which is the play of interoceptive signals that are happening in the background to all of this other stuff, and then I'll use that in a new example. So it's not simply, and Dan didn't think it was either, that I watch my own and others' people's gross behavior and infer a simplified self-model. You know, my simplified self-model is based on a lot more than that. It's based on all of this internal signaling that I'm privy to all the time in an interesting sense. You know, these are the signals running through my body. They're not running through your body. You're probably not feeling as nervous now as I am. Okay. So my model building is constantly informed by all of these internal signals that are carrying real information about the state of my body, about its readiness for different kinds of action. You know, I could throw the microphone down and run out of the room if things go awry. So, courtesy of all those signals, we engage the external world in ways that are constantly informed by the brain's attempts to, amongst other things, balance our own energy budget. I missed a slide there, which is actually quite an important one, about state of body readiness for action. Include hormonal and cytokine signaling, molecules, swathes of neurotransmitters, thermal signals, cardiovascular and gastrointestinal signals, and information conveyed by tissue stretch receptors. That list could go on and on, but the idea is just there's an awful lot more going on than just stuff coming in from the outside. Can't do it. So courtesy of all those signals, we can engage the world in ways that are constantly informed by my brain's attempt to balance its own energy budget, selecting actions in ways that keep me within homeostatic and allostatic bounds. So there's a lot of interesting work here from Lisa Feldman-Barrett, Anil Seth, Giovanna Pazzullo, and others, basically on the role of interoceptive inference within something broadly like a predictive processing economy. So at that point, a predictive grip on multi-scale structure in the external world, I think, gets combined with a predictive grip on our own internal physiological states. And actually, I think it's one of the things distinctive of the way that people are exploring the predictive processing work right now, is that this crunch is central to so much of that work. It's central to a lot of the work in computational psychiatry, for example, and just generally, the big crunch, if you like, is what I think is distinctive of this work. It's crunching together internal, external, and action readiness information all the time in a kind of single space that is the space of how creatures like us move around and respond to our worlds. We encounter the world in ways that reflect our own present and anticipated energetic needs and the bodily significance of the actions that we're currently positioned to perform. That's where I think something worth calling basic sentience exists. I think any creature that is in some way superimposing and crunching together all those sources of information counts as, broadly speaking, sentient. So we certainly get plants out of that. You know, plants have a version of that. Insects certainly do. All the other obvious stuff does. Rocks, I don't think do. I don't think that's doing it. Okay. So intervening qualia are then the posits of the simplified self model that takes all those sources of information on board and is geared to predicting my own and others' behaviors. And I think, as I say, predictive processing is particularly good at this, but any other framework that highlighted prediction and control and crunched all those signals together would do just as well, as far as I can tell. What you don't want to do, I think, is what some Bayesians do, which is, if you like, think about computing, first of all, an optimal model of how the outside world is, and then computing the optimal course of action within that world. That's dividing things up too strongly. What you want to do is compute your optimal, compute how the external world is in ways that are already informed by your energy budget, your potential for different actions, etc. So I think there's a division here in the space of Bayesian approaches between optimizing for perception and then doing all the other stuff versus optimizing everything all at once. Okay. And I've got a manuscript on this where I try to argue that that's what's really what predictive processing and active inference are currently able to do better than anybody else, which is be a perception action value machine, crunch it all together all the time. Okay, so I think that an introceptively inflected Bayesian picture that includes a simplified self-model used for self-understanding, communication, and the prediction of other agents is pretty much the whole story. I think once you've got that, you have done it. They're all the ingredients we need to finally escape Cartesian gravity and see qualia for what they are. Inferred states, content items that compress important patterns in bodily response and behavior, including those internal patterns. So I'm going to now try out a new example, then try out the old questions with the new example and this so far in mind. Here we go. Yeah, strap in tight. This may or may not work. It's actually the first time I presented this example, so anything could happen. Okay, so the example here turns on a kind of metabolic paradox. There's a traditional picture of aging in which cells die off, stuff malfunctions, and many bodily processes slow down. You can sort of find this picture out there. But if you zoom into the cellular level, what you see is something different. As we age, cellular level energy expenditure actually increases. This is from the key paper here, although there's a whole bunch of them now, is the Shulson paper, the brain-body energy conservation model of aging. Okay. So Shulson and colleagues say, contrary to common wisdom, recent work has shown that aging cells and tissues consume increasing amounts of energy and become hypermetabolic. They're not slowing down, they're going faster. This is because responses to damage incur new costs of repair, and especially damage signaling, cytokine signaling, etc. This results in hypermetabolism at the cellular level. So a little quote just to give you the flavor of this. When we look under the hood, beneath the plasma membrane of aging cells, senescence increases mitochondrial biogenesis and mitochondrial mass, subserving increased energy consumption. You're getting more mitochondrial activity, not less. Older cells display increased protein content per cell, 47% higher mitochondrial mass and mitochondrial hyperfusion, features generally associated with elevated cellular energy demand. So, you know, more action at the cell level than there was before. Aging cells become hypermetabolic. They have more, not less, mitochondria. This is called the hyperfunction theory of aging. Okay. So let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that that's a good theory of aging. You know? So that would mean that it's still the case the traditional picture isn't entirely wrong. Despite cellular level hypermetabolism, whole body energy expenditure really does decrease with age. For example, this is very depressing, but there it is. From about age 60, size-adjusted total daily energy expenditure decreases by approximately 7% per decade. Okay. This is what they think of as the paradox of hypermetabolism. Whole body energy expenditure down, cell level energy expenditure up. You can probably see where this is going. So how do you resolve the paradox? In a way, it's fairly straightforward. The missing link, they argue, is the brain. Hey, hey. In response to the increased energy demands flowing from cellular hypermetabolism, mostly detected via all that cytokine signaling, the brain intervenes to balance the energy budget. So the cells want more and more energy. Where's it going to come from? One place you can maybe get some of that is by damping down whole body activity as these demands increase. So equipped with a kind of energy budget reflecting what we eat and how well we process it, the brain imposes savings at the whole body level to pay for the increased costs that are now emerging at the cellular level. This has now become known as the brain-body energy conservation model of aging. So, you know, these are consistent models with different titles. Okay, other responses like frailty and reduced muscle mass are probably also in the business of reducing energy demand. And also, crucially, we save on whole body expenditure by losing motivation for high-intensity activities. They say sex is an example. Anyway, this suggests a subtly different take on aging itself. As they say, traditional medical thinking sees the aging phenotype as a pathological expression, probably driven by damage accumulation. The brain energy conservation model presents them as adaptive recalibrations driven by the brain intervening on whole body activity. I mean, all this stuff is driven in many ways by the brain, but it's the brain's interventions on whole body energy expenditure that are the core here. So that's why we sure don't feel as if we're hotbeds of cellular level energetic activity. Instead, what we feel is slow, sluggish, fatigued, etc. Now let's ask, how does all this look to a self-reporting narrative spinning agent? And we sort of wind it round to some of the Dan ways of doing things. First of all, the aging person finds themselves less inclined to perform strenuous whole body tasks. That's just the brain trying to balance the energy budget to pay for cellular level hypermetabolism. That all seems sensible enough. But that change in action selection tendencies cries out for some sort of explanation. Your sort of self-narrating Bayesian brain now wants to explain what's going on here, what's happening to me. So the narrative spinning elements of our self-reflective Bayesian brain infer that there's a new force at work, stopping us from seeking out the same levels of activity as before. We name this new force feelings of fatigue and tiredness, and we may incorrectly posit these as the causes of our increasing inactivity. I think Dennett has this exactly right. It's not that irreducible tiredness qualia first enter the mental stage, and then I reduce my level of whole body activity accordingly. That's the wrong order. Instead, the brain-induced tendency to save energy at the whole body level acts as a kind of datum for a self-narrative that needs an explanation, and it infers I'm having an experience of tiredness. The experience of tiredness just is the recognition of these interventions on whole body energy expenditure. And we just name it feelings of tiredness because we don't know the other story. So there's no double transduction. We've definitely cut out the middle toad. What we got here is an energy budgeting brain that sent something like a near imperative command to reduce whole body action. So I think this is in the ballpark of Colin Klein's sort of work on pain. Pain as a kind of imperative to sort of protect a bodily part, for example. It's a near imperative. Strong enough goals can overcome it, but it's a near imperative to not overdo it, And also, you need an inference to qualia, made by a narrative spinning element confronted with a noteworthy pattern, a change of pattern here in our own tendencies and activities. Okay, move it along. da, 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 da. Point it somewhere. Don't give up now. You can do it. There we go. Okay. God, where is it? There. Okay. Importantly, we don't have direct access to these underlying causes. You know, it took science to give us this picture of cellular level hypermetabolism and brain-based intervention to balance the energy budgets. We have no access to any of that stuff. As a result, these functional imperatives on whole body action are mistaken for something like intrinsic qualitative imperatives. I just feel too tired to do it today. Kind of end of story. It's as if the feeling of fatigue explains why I choose to stay home rather than tackle the mountain. But actually, that's the illusion. It's not the feeling of fatigue there, it's the brain's intervention on whole body activity that I then infer is me feeling fatigued. So importantly, the inferred cause here, extreme tiredness, has very little of the structure of the true cause. It looks to the agent like a simple atomic feature, when what it really reflects is this huge economy of internal signaling, stored knowledge, goals, energy budgeting, etc. The hidden economy includes all that information about internal state, estimated future supply and demand, standing goals and priorities. There's a lot going on. Not knowing that, the precise profile of my own tiredness can seem surprising even to me. I might even ponder the possibility of fatigue zombies, beings that exhibit all of our fatigue behavior, including all that I say and do about my own fatigues, yet really feel nothing at all. They feel no fatigue. They've slowed down their whole body energy expenditure, etc. They're, supporting cellular hypermetabolism. They're spinning narratives, but they're not feeling anything. I think we should reject that as a possibility. I think that we have just told you what fatigue is, and now you're saying, well, now imagine that it wasn't that. So all this contributes, I think, to the mistaken sense that qualitative experiences are potent yet irreducible facts about an inner realm. On the cruise, Dan, citing Keith Frankish, summarizes this by saying, that creates qualia as artifacts of the limits of our knowledge. I think that's a good line. Okay, now we reach the final bit, classic worries revisited. Here we go. So, what do we say? Suppose that you buy some of that. Are you saying that my feelings of tiredness are not real? Oh, that would be nice, wouldn't it? Excuse me. No. But what is the feeling of tiredness? It's nothing other than the combination of the energy budgeting brains, enforced savings on large-scale action, and my own inferred experience of tiredness. That's all that there is. But wait, does that mean that only narrative-spinning animals like us really feel tired? Oh, no, not at all. The core element here is the brain's intervention upon whole-body action tendencies. I think I share that with stick insects, to be honest, I used to keep stick insects, and the older they get, the slower they get. They're not very fast to begin with, but they get noticeably slower the older that they get. So I think that their brains are intervening on whole body activity for the same kinds of reasons. This is shared with huge swathes of the animal kingdom. So what happens? As you add or remove stuff from the rich generative model of self and world, the impact of tiredness changes. I think that is important. Excuse me. Yay, come on. For example, I may see my own tiredness as a portent of a long and unstoppable decline. My cat is clearly spared the deep temporal aspect of the self-narrative of tiredness. It just slows down, don't worry about it. But I might, being a human, see it as a reason to take supplements, make lifestyle changes, push back against some of the root causes of all that cellular level hypermetabolism. I might even find that telling myself the right stories about aging as the increase of wisdom with good activities, etc. So I can sort of induce placebo anti-tiredness effects in myself by reaching down from the top. Okay, classic rejoinder. Here's Dave, probably giving that classic rejoinder in Greenland. What you got here is a bunch of signals and inference. At best, it's still just a recipe for a clever judging machine. But if that's all there really is, Dave will say, Why does my tiredness feel the way it does? Why does it feel like anything at all? And I just think that the more we look into particular examples in some detail, the less we're going to be impressed by that response. I think we can now turn that challenge upside down. So imagine, if you will, a language-using being with only limited access to its own processing, whose brain is busy dampening whole-body activity to compensate for cellular-level hypermetabolism. Just imagine that. You invite that being to perform an arduous but potentially quite rewarding task. Maybe it's climbing a steep mountain. It's a language user. What can it say? It might say, look, I just don't fancy it. But we can push each other for reasons. And if pushed for more reasons, why not just say, sorry, I'm just feeling a bit tired. It's just, I'm too fatigued to climb that mountain today. Not happening. In fact, the report of some kind of invisible, unstructured inner force, the feeling of tiredness, seems to me very, very natural at this point. The reporting agent correctly detects the dampening of my own tendencies to whole-body experience. I may call it tiredness, but all I've done really is name that pattern. What about creatures whose brains intervene to dampen down whole-body activity, but who don't have a self-model that posits feelings of tiredness as a cause of their own altered activity profile? They're, stick insects. There is actually, that's one of my stick insects, one of the few remaining pictures of my own, now dead and buried, literally, stick insects. What do we say about such beings? I think we've got two coherent options, and nothing in current science, I think, can resolve these options. Dan's own writings conveniently managed to go both ways on this, as far as I can see. So we can either think of feeling tired as a simple thing that reaches way down the tree of life to wherever you've got that sort of core pattern, brain intervention on whole body activity in order to, for example, support cellular level hypermetabolism. So you can think, okay, that's going a long way down. Or if you're really impressed by the effects of self-narrative, you think it's a higher level thing whose presence reflects the nature and richness of the self-model too. You think that you've only got real tiredness when you can sort of respond to tiredness in many of the additional ways that I can because I've inferred a feeling of tiredness and I can try and push back against that feeling. So I think that either of those are coherent options currently. Which is it really? I don't think we shouldn't even attempt to answer that question. I don't think really deep down that this is a limitation of current science. I think this is just it. We can't say any more than we already said. I think there's no simple fact of the matter about the presence or absence of a given so-called qualitative state. In this case, the state of feeling tired. Fairly simple one. Instead of trying to draw bright lines between the really tired and the merely seeming tired, like maybe the stick insects, why not simply think about different animals as occupying different places in a high-dimensional space with many crisscrossing patterns of similarity and difference? A picture that I got years ago from my old computer science professor, Aaron Sloman, who wrote a book back in 1978 called The Computer Revolution in Philosophy. And one of the key ideas there was don't try and draw these bright lines. Think about the space of variation that our dichotomous concepts are maybe pointing to. Ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. And this, I think, is where Dennett really excelled, was showing us the shape of those spaces, the careful elaboration of the warp and the weft of multiple design elements, both inner and outer. In that complex kind of space, minds like ours can be both special and continuous with non-human animal minds too. So maybe there is no tension in Dan's work there. It's just a recognition that these are big spaces and that we can do no more than point at where different creatures are in this space. So, where does that leave the very idea of qualia? We are coming to the end of this excursion. The idea of classic qualia, if this is right, arises due to our odd combination of cleverness and limited access. So that makes it seem a bit illusiony. But the patterns that qualia talk are trying to capture and compress are real enough. Look at that pattern in behavior of tiredness and aging. That's a real pattern. Yay, come on back. And only bits of that real pattern depend on the fact that we humans have long temporal horizons and we can name and discuss our feelings and experiences. Parts of the pattern do depend on that, but not all of the pattern. So now we're kind of going to say, so which bits of the pattern really matter again? I think we should reject that way of proceeding. We should go this way instead. So I think we've got a choice. You could go towards full-blown illusionism. Qualia are mistaken posits that reflect our deep ignorance of how we really work. I do want to go that way. You know, Dave wants me to be a proper illusionist and not some wishy-washy kind of half illusionist, half not. But I can detect the sort of wishy-washiness. It's a possibility. There's another route here that leads to a kind of revisionary phenomenal realism. What we thought of as those irreducible qualia, things whose intrinsic properties are partially explanatory of the effects that they have, etc. These are really just inferred content items, but nonetheless the patterns that they're capturing are real enough independently of our own narrative and inferential actions. So, you know, you've pushed your qualia away a bit. They're inferred content items now. They're nothing special, but you can still say that just like dogs and cats and icebergs, they capture some real stuff about patterns in the world as presented by our own energetic flow and flux. Nearly. Ta-ta. Yes, the lines between eliminativism and radical revisionism are never clear. I think that's true. You know, if science and philosophy go one way or the other here, it will be sociology and chance that accounts for it more than any deep conceptual argument or reason. Come on. One thing that I think might help, but we don't have it yet, would be a good scientific picture of what immersion in language and external representational resources is doing to minds like ours. This is part of my current ERC project, but I don't think we have such a model. There's a very nice picture from an ex-student of mine who's now one of the Google DeepMind engineer folk, and he's got a lovely paper called Wanting to be Understood Creates a Hard Problem of Consciousness, very much about the impact of language on minds like ours. Highly recommended. I think if we knew more about that, we might find ourselves opting towards the narrative really, really matters versus maybe the narrative doesn't matter quite as much, but we don't have that account yet. So is that the end? Consciousness solved? Well, clearly not. All the hard work would remain to be done. You can escape Cartesian gravity, great, but all you've done is shift the focus from hopeless puzzles about classic qualia to other puzzles like unraveling energy management and information flow in living beings, working out what language does to minds like ours. You know, there's no shortage of good topics. So, and just a note of humility at that point. This is the Open Worm project, open source software project trying to build a digital twin of the nematode worm. 959 cells, 302 neurons, 14 years into the project, and the worm, the simulated worm, is still not behaving in all the wormy ways that you might hope. Probably this fits with Mike Levin's kind of ideas that what you're modeling so far just doesn't go down far enough. It's not got enough of the sort of the full computational profile of life to be giving you the right behaviors. But, you know, I think stuff like the open worm should keep us humble, even if we have managed at last to escape the pull of Cartesian gravity. That's the end. Thank you.